Are there other manuscripts besides these two, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Aleph or Sinaiticus, that do not have the long ending of Mark's Gospel? Among Greek manuscripts, they're the only ones. They're both from the 4th century, but one of the fascinating things is that we have early versions in other languages that don't have the long ending, or they have it after a shorter ending that is another kind of a conclusion that must have been added earlier than this long ending was added, because it's colorless, it's not all that interesting. This is a very interesting ending, these 12 verses. But on top of that, we have early church fathers, Eusebius, who has the wealth of the Emperor Constantine behind him, because Constantine commissioned him in 332 to produce 50 Bibles for the capital city, New Rome or Constantinople, for all the new churches, since Constantine had made Christianity legal. And so Eusebius in his workshop in Caesarea had access to a great number of manuscripts, and what he wrote about was that the vast majority of manuscripts that he had seen did not have the long ending of Mark's Gospel. We're talking about somebody who was not isolated, somebody who was in a very important center with a great deal of wealth behind him from the eastern part of the empire, at the early part of the 4th century. Towards the end of the 4th century, almost beginning of the 5th, Jerome, who was living in Bethlehem at the time, was commissioned by the Pope to translate the Greek New Testament and Hebrew Old Testament into Latin, and he created what's called the Vulgate. And so here it is about 70, 80 years later, and he also wrote about these manuscripts, and he said, the vast majority of manuscripts in Greek do not have this long ending. Well, that might imply that maybe the long ending was added in Latin. We're not sure. But the fact is that here in the 4th century, we have two scholars, one who has the access to the wealth of the empire in the East, another one who has the access to the wealth of the Vatican, the Catholic Church, before it was called the Catholic Church, in the West. And neither one of them can find very many manuscripts that have the long ending. So what is in a majority of manuscripts today was certainly not in a majority of manuscripts in the 4th century. These two manuscripts are the oldest we have, and yet they don't have it, but they must have been in the majority of manuscripts in the 4th century. And so one of the things we do as we examine these manuscripts is we don't try to count how many manuscripts are on each side, but we try to weigh the manuscripts instead of counting them. And Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are two manuscripts that deserve to be weighed very, very heavily in our calculations.